Voy a presentar a la ponente Natalia.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to introduce you to Natalia Ojeda del Pozo. She's a professor in the University of Deusto. She's got a PhD on neuropsychology and specialized in psychology and clinical psychology. And she's also been awarded by a certification by the American Psychological Association. She's got a postdoc with the Johns Hopkins Medical Institution. She's director of a department on studies for psychology. She's expert on neuropsychology. She's part of the International Society of Neuropsychology. She's representative in the south of Europe for the Association of Neuropsychologists and president of the Association in Navarra for neuropsychology. She directs a research team of 23 researchers on psychosis, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder, brain and neuroimaging, dementia, Parkinson, multiple sclerosis, diagnosis and treatment. She's got 22 years behind her in her background of experience with kids and adults. She's published more than 100 scientific articles, 6 books, 37 chapters, and has taken part in over 400 conferences around these topics. She's a consultant to the government of the Basque Country and other governments, as well as to the World WHO. Amongst others, she also works on health networks for health, mental health. She's got a wide profile on international research in the Johns Hopkins Institute. She's also a consultant in research. The floor is yours, Natalia. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure being here with all of you in a context such as this to see the success of this Congress with over 2,000 trainers and people so interested in knowing how the brain works and how it works and how to use it better to motivate learning and to help our kids and future adults to learn better and improve our society. For me, it's a fascinating topic. It's a great satisfaction as a personal area. It's not, as you can see, as you have heard, it's not my normal area of expertise, but doing it at home, it's even better. Imagining the potential impact that such a Congress as this one can have. So congratulations to all of you, and especially to the organization, for this huge challenge. Today I want to focus and share some of the knowledge that we, the neuroscientists, can give you. This knowledge will help you to confirm some of the ideas that many of us that have in mind and to demystify some of those that we had before and we don't anymore. When you finish your study, you believe some things, and then with time you realize that things are different. Some of them are even obsolete. So I'll try to share some of this information with you. We'll talk a bit about the structure of the brain. Let's see what the brain works, how the brain works, how it develops, what parts are relevant and for what. I think it's very important to keep this in mind when we're designing intervention programs connected to learning, to memory. Know how the biological basis of our brain allow us to receive this information and what elements are relevant when we are acquiring this knowledge. We'll then talk about the most important learning functions and where they lie within our brain. And the third part of one of the topics that probably might be mostly interesting for you, for your day-to-day work, how can we modify, or whether we can modify this. They were asking me if there will be some time for questions and hours. I'm available to you. I will stay as long as it's necessary. And if we have to leave the room because there's another presentation after it, I'll be more than happy to talk to you in the outside of the room as long as it takes. So let's see what's the structure of our brain. The main idea, the basic unit, it's a neuron. We know that, our brain cells. Sometimes we forget that part of this neuron network doesn't only develop when the baby is born, but this neuron structure and part of the functioning of it starts working way before the mother starts creating this fetus. There's many variables in the lifestyle of that mother and the father that will determine what the structure and the function of these brain cells will be. Of course, everything that happens during pregnancy and once the baby is born, everything that happens along its life will determine their brain structure. Life habits, education, of course, everything will have an influence. And this will happen not only in the shaping of this structure, but especially in these branches in the top and bottom part of the neurons. Through certain biochemical and electrical processes, we are biochemistry and electricity. That's what we are. It's important that the proteins can be synthesized appropriately and that these neuron synapses happen, and that this happens in an appropriate way. This will determine the creation of these brain cells. We will then be able to use the processed information appropriately. There's lots of biochemical processes that I will not talk about today that will allow us appropriate synapses. One of the myths that we had until now, we said that it was important to have these synapses during the day-to-day activities, whether we're kids or adults, during learning at school, what happens in leisure periods, or out of school, at home. It's not completely true. It's important what happens during the day and what happens during the night. That's why it's so important to respect our sleeping time. Our sleep hours are reconstructing time. We have the highest number of synthesization of proteins in the brain, and it's essential to keep memory, to recall the information that we've had in the day-to-day activities. And if this protein synthesization is not done appropriately, learning will disappear. I tell my student it's no use studying last minute. They've told us all our life long, okay, we might pass your exam, but you're not going to learn. The idea is to know that it's not only what our teachers tell us, but there is a biochemical idea behind it, underlying that sleeping is necessary for memory and recalling. We also need to understand that sometimes that stimulus between neurons, between all these regions, can happen and can give a stimulus that can produce short-term changes. When there's an idea, for example, stimulus we've learned at a point in school, and if it doesn't have a great impact and is not associated to an emotional reaction, that stimulus will not affect on a stable basis to the neuron structures. When will we have stable and long-lasting changes? Well, when there is a repetitive activity, there is an activation, a repetitive activation of the same processes. This is essential. And I don't mean that we have to go over and over and over and over again the same topics as we did when we were at school a long time ago. And we had to learn by heart list of kings and queens. We're talking about repetitive activation, where we can go over the same context, but from different perspectives, from different versions, same version, same information, but different versions in a different way, integrating all the sensitive channels that we can find. And when this happens, we will stimulate the plasticity of the brain cells. Brain cells are going to be receptive to this information, and then learning will happen in a more stable and more efficient way. Another idea that I'd like to share is to break the stereotype that this can only happen during development of the brain period. When I studied, until I was 20-something, our neuroscientist at that time told us that those stages of plasticity happened more or less until you were 20. There were two big landmarks. Well, first your first year of life, then until you were 10, and then until you were 18, 20, and from then there will be deterioration. We now know that this is not so. This is wrong, actually, that these synaptic changes can happen all along our lives and even with pathologies and serious disorders and diseases. So there's clear ideas on new brain cells, and there are some other concepts that have to do with the structure of the central nervous system. We are so worried often about the brain that we forget sometimes that there's more to the system than just the brain. We have the brain, of course, but also the spine. And this spine is the trunk. It's what connects us with the sensorial, the visions, hearing, taste, all the senses that we have. And for these channels, we need the receptivity of this spine. It allows us to receive both all the senses, all the stimulus that come all over our body, in all the whole body, in our head, but also in our limbs. But all this information has to be taken as a unit, so it can be managed appropriately. Of course, what happens in the brain is much more important. But don't forget about the spine. First question we will have: how do our two hemispheres work? One of the myths that we know that has been confirmed is that each of our hemispheres has a high specialization. They work on certain areas. Our right hemisphere is going to be our organic basis for reasoning, for logic information. It also has to do with information that is given to us on a verbal point of view. Literacy is very much associated to this analytic part. We also know that our left brain cell, that you can see on the other side, it's inverted in the slide, and it has to do with creativity, problem solving, different alternatives, way of seeing life in a different point of view. Traditionally, our educational models were based essentially in the right side of the brain. But this is clearly not enough. Why would we want to learn only one type of knowledge? Why wouldn't we want to use in a more efficient and more developed way our other hemisphere? Why would we only want to use one half? We also know that these two hemispheres work in such a way that their networks are connected from the front to the back, going all through the internal structures. But what's really interesting is that all the information that each of the hemispheres have are also connected in this other sense, so in this other direction. So there's always a connection, an integrated share of information between these two hemispheres. So in a normal brain, information that one of the hemispheres receives is constantly communicated to the other. And what is most important is that if the information from both hemispheres is coherent, that integration will allow that fixing of information, and learning will be very interesting in the long term. This will allow kids and adults to use this information all along their life. The problem comes when the information that both hemispheres receive are contradictory. There seems to be some kind of blocking of the information because networks say, hey, alert, what happens? What's going on here? There's contradiction. This is not appropriate to what the other side is saying, and they both compete to try to use the resources of the person and try to focus on what is really happened in this incoherence. I don't mean that this is wrong. This can help us to think in a more critical way or take a break, take another perspective of the information that we're processing. But when we're developing in the early stages, it's much better that the processed information by the two hemispheres is coherent and is being integrated in a fastest and enriching way. I haven't said it, but for each of these activities, our brain is taking energy, and we have limited energy. We're using glucose and oxygen, but we've got a limited source of fuel. And if we use it for certain resources, we can't use it for certain others. It's as easy as that. In the hemispheres, another stereotype that has been confirmed is that our brain is highly specialized, not only in hemisphere communities, but also how the different lobes out of which it's formed. It's very specialized. In the history of neuroscience, we spoke at some point about phrenology, craniometry, localization in the brain, and they said this region is used for this and this other for that other thing. And then there was a revolution in the neuroscience, and they said, alert, careful, because the brain has to work as a whole. And as a whole, it means that the whole brain is important, and the whole brain takes part in learning and processing and memorizing. And it's not one or the other. We know that both versions are correct. But the high specialization still exists, and each of these lobes is specializing in certain specific tasks and capacities. What are one of these lobes can be doing things that others won't do, and this makes great sense from the perspective of energy and consumption. Imagine a society if all your health centers, if your educational centers, you all had to do everything. You wouldn't do it right, and you wouldn't make much sense. So in the brain happens the same. Each region specializes to the maximum to do the work the best, and then there will be an integration, a general integration. These regions are connected, and information flows from one side to the other. I'd like to highlight that we're going from a more general perspective to a more specific. We've spoken about the brain cells, the system, the nervous system, the hemispheres, and here we can see the specialization of the cortex. We can see how out of the whole cortex, not all parts of it have the same function. We talk very often about the connection between frontal cortex and their personality, prefrontal and executive control, planning, execution, efficacy, problem solving. These highly specialized activities are in our frontal lobe, but not every part of the frontal lobe has the same competence over these activities. There's a high specialization, and we know that knowledge is available. We know what regions participate in each of these activities. And the same happens all in the rest of the cortex. We all know Wernicke, Broca regions, highly specialized areas for reading, speaking, understanding language. With this high specialization, they are also start being developed during the pregnancy. And when we study the brain of fetus, we know that hearing processing that is still being processed, it's highly activated in the Broca and Wernicke's area. If this specialization is done appropriately, we will have specialized regions in hearing, processing and moving and visual processing, etc. But this goes further. And as we go into a more micro level, each of these cortexes, we will have a higher specialization area, and these are the Brodmann areas. Inside this area, these numbers that you can see are approximate areas of the structure that will allow us to say that region 21 or region 44, correction by the speaker, that allows us to express orally, it's this area and not any other. And how do we know this? Well, because we know that there's brain damage in this area, their speaking abilities will be limited. We will also see what happens with brain plasticity. But we will see a period of time in which this person will have a high limitation of their speaking capacity. And it happens the same with visual processing, hearing processing, touching processing, moving areas, etc. If we explore the whole brain, each of these Brodmann areas are specialized in one or other areas, in areas that you are trying to teach and help develop. This specialization in adults is already fixed from early stages. Of course, there's still new connections and in development, but this structure it's already solid as of the age of 5-6 years old. So we've gone from the cortex, from the outside area, and we are going to go into the internal structures of the brain, because it's not only what happens outside of the brain. We also have to see what happens inside. You probably all have had an experience where we've learned something. We weren't even aware that we were learning, but it had an emotional component in a positive way, especially. Also negative, it can also produce post-traumatic stress syndrome. That's very hardly fixed in the brain, but let's think positive. We are here to change society in a positive and constructive way. If we think of an early experience, probably our first vital memories are all associated to an emotion, and even in my case, to a smell. Every time I think of these internal structures, I always remember the same example. And I share with my students. And one of my first memories when I was a girl has to do with the experience of living with my grandparents in the countryside. With my grandparents, and I was lucky enough at that time that the next door house was a bakery. I could wake every morning, not only with a bird song, that was sensitive stimulus that I'd love to happen every single morning of my life, but I could also smell that deliciously baked cakes early in the morning. I have very early memories associated to this emotional moment, this smelling moment, to the extent that this only happened during a few months of my life, but they're enough for me to, every time I go past a bakery and I smell sponge cakes, that that memory comes to me in a very vivid way, in such a way that I have to buy the cake. Why does this happen? Why do you also have something like this? Well, for a very simple structure, very simple reason. These internal structures, since they are developed in the fetus, they are connected from the very early stages, and the hippocampus and the amygdala are essential for learning and memorizing. Without these structures, we could not learn nor remember. And these two structures are highly connected to our limbic system, that is the brain system, the emotional limbic system, the emotional brain system. It processes all our emotions. It's essential for survival in our early times of human beings, when we lived in caverns. It was the one that told us to be alert when there was a fierce animal coming towards us, or when we were going to risk our life. If that product, that vegetable you were going to eat, that fruit you were going to eat, if it didn't smell well enough, that could kill us. So these are structures that anthropologically have had this very relevant function. They're secondary elements nowadays, but they have a priority position and reflex in our brain. Nowadays, in our society, smell is a secondary role. It's more aesthetic issue. If we've got perfume on, we'll be nicer, but it's not vital sense. But this sense is got a connection, a priority connection to learning and to fixing long-term memory. All these structures are connected and they can work in a coordinated way. Imagine the potential that you will have to work when stimulating and sharing a knowledge if we can integrate these components as a unit. Content, experience, emotion, and if we even include sponge cake, well, even better. We said that these structures are essential for learning and remembering, but there's other structures at the same level. I'm going to go back to the slide. Look, they seem to be in the same level, at the same height in our brain, more or less. They're part of the same unit, but they've got a different name. They're called basal ganglia. And they're essential for movement. So when we are stimulating movement, early moving training in kids, what we're trying to do is to get these structures to get the appropriate coordination and connections. And once they do it, they're going to send all the information they have processed to the anterior part of our brain, to an area that is more or less here, that is called supplementary motor cortex. And I know the movement. For example, I can dance a choreography, for example, and then once I know it, once these structures have told me the information is available, they're going to send through brain connection to the supplementary cortex. And that is going to set off movement. It's going to make us execute these movements. But we need this first basis. We can't just focus on what it is expressed. There has to be well settled. Information has to be very well settled before that, through integrity and the appropriate use of these brain structures. How do we know all this? Well, you know, psychologists and psychopedagogists, there are many ways of assessing all these concepts, especially in their behavioral expression, how they express. We've got intelligence, attention tests, learning, memory tests. and we use them, but there's other type of information that we can obtain and that is very revealing for our science. Neuroimaging, studies of damaged areas. We can see very peculiar damages of these structures, and non-invasive studies, of course. Any brain, any healthy brain can be studied from the outside without damaging. We can have an MRI, we have to stay there without moving, so we can have photographs being taken from our brain. We can do this not only to study how beautiful and well made they are, and not from the anatomic perspective, but also from the functional point of view. We've got very well developed techniques of MRI imaging, and we can see how they're working in an appropriate way. This is the machine that we said, this MRI that we've had. Some of us may have had to go through it, but there's many other types of machines in this way. If you're not very happy when you're going in closed spaces, well, there's very more progressed models that these donuts is open, is half a donut. They're open, it's much more comfortable, with a great potential. And we won't only need to put our head in that small hole. No, we can have it in a more open area. These donuts will go round, and with thanks to that, we will be able to visualize the cortex and more deep and even deeper and more specific structures in the brain. 15 years ago, this would have been impossible to imagine. I did my PhD 20 years ago. I still keep these images, and they have nothing to do to what we thought it was the state of the art at that time. Until recent years, we couldn't see live brains. Until recently, we could only see post-mortem brains. Fortunately, we can see living brains. We can observe it when the person is not doing anything. Of course, you can't really guarantee if this person is relaxed or is thinking on what they did in the morning, on the shopping list. But let's think that the brain is calm, and we can get to the structure, the function, while the brain is active. We can ask the person inside the MRI scan, we can ask them to, okay, think what you learned today at school. I'm going to ask you about it afterwards, okay? Or I can even present some external stimulus that can be connected with the information. And I'm exploring how this brain is processing the information and how it's working. And I can obtain conclusions if this is being appropriate or not. Through very sophisticated techniques that we have in digital software, we can even calculate make mathematic calculation on the energy consumption that the brain does in each of these processes and these tasks that the brain is doing, and what is the volume of the structure that the brain is using. We could see if our hippocampus is the same size, if the kid's hippocampus is the same as it was, is the same size as I expected comparing to other kids. We can see if connections that we can see here, those lines that we can see, so colorful lines, they are connected brain cells, and they share information. They divert information from one side to the other. This is state-of-the-art technology, and it's only been available all around the world for the last 3 or 4 years ago, and we're doing it locally here. We don't only need to think that things can be done in the States. We can also do sophisticated things here. This clinical technology is available here. We couldn't even dream of this 15 years ago. But we can check through this. We can check if things are working well. But let's imagine it's a grouping of a kid with hyperactive disorder or lack of attention, we can see if the flow of information is working appropriately once the work has been done with him. We can also see that there's differences not only on the functional way of working of the information, but also of the specific structures that take part in these functions and what's the volume of each of them. Because this is important because we know that we can change both. We can change the structure and the function all along our life. This with brains that have gone through pathology. Imagine what you could potentially do on a healthy brain. When I write here bold response, we will see some images on energy consumption. When I talk about the brain working, transferring information, doing some processing of information, learning new information, what we are saying that we are doing is consuming glucose and oxygen. That's what our brain feeds on. The air we breathe and the food we give to it. When we metabolize this and we send it to the brain, and the brain needs energy to learn, that's why we say that the kid that hasn't had breakfast doesn't give the same response as the others at school. Obviously, they don't get the good glucose, not donuts, not Nutella, chocolate spread. No, healthy products, healthy glucose, healthy products offer a much better glucose level to the brain, and learning will be much, much better. But it's glucose and oxygen. And that's what we understand to be as bold response. And this is the information that we're going to see in different colors for specific functions and specific areas in the brain. Which are these functions? These are the functions that are part of our learning processes. All along the sessions in which you work on a daily basis, or with which I work with my students. Even all of us who, when we go out, we're in our leisure period, those different activities, what we do with that change the bold responses in our brain. Some examples of how this happens. Well, we know that the frontal area of our brain is highly specified in all these functions that we hear: attention, category classification, processing speed, cognitive flexibility, planning, decision-taking, etc. Flexibility when changing patterns or when some criteria changes, and how capable we are to adapt to a change or not. If we're rigid, if we persevere. All these will depend on our frontal lobes. Planning an activity, setting it in place, integrating external feedback, getting to the information, incorporating it into the brain, giving a response of the brain. All this has to do with our frontal lobes. And of course, taking decisions. This is the executive function at its best, as we understood it in the business world. The high executive of a company, because that's the one that plans, that takes decisions, etc. But we're all executors of our own behavior, and our frontal lobes are the ones guiding this planning and this activity development. What does this mean? Well, that every single region of these frontal lobes, the medial regions, the dorsolateral regions have a specific function of those that we saw in the previous slide. And what is most important is that we know that frontal lobes are also those that integrate and set the basis of our personality as adults. All of us are here. How many of you do you think are extroverts? Socially reasonable, that react appropriately. Oh, you're really shy. Come on. I'm sure there's more of you. If you're teachers and you educate people, I'm sure there's a higher percentage of extrovert people. But probably here you're a little shy and you're careful. You've got your highly activated frontal lobe. You're adapting to the context. Okay. We should know that the personality and the development of our personality, how introvert or not, or how well we adapt to society or not, it all has to do with our frontal lobes. And we've known this for centuries. There were many clinical cases of persons with damaged areas. They have probably had an impact, a wound, and that had gone through, the bullet had gone through their brain. Philip Gates, for example, you will know him. He had a rod going through his frontal lobe while he was working in the railway. He had a working accident. He had these frontal areas were damaged. He survived, but he did in a radical way to what he was before.